guys, another week. Hope you're doing okay. And we're on to Psalm number 14. So let's get involved. So obviously start with the title, To the Choir Master, and it's a Psalm of David, and it's just normal sort of stuff. That's kind of shows that it was meant to be a musical composition at some point for public worship. And of David, we've been through this before. It could have been written by David, probably was, but it could also have been for David or to David. So interesting. Psalm 53 is almost identical. If you can look forward and read that, you'll maybe spot that it's almost word for word the same, but with some tiny differences. And it's sometimes an interesting exercise to play spot the difference with almost identical things. And I would just comment that some people think that having two identical psalms is it shows that there's been sort of sloppy compiling or editing. I just personally think the Bible is just so it's such a well-crafted piece, and there's so much literary genius going on there that I struggle to believe that anything is there by accident or from sloppiness in the Bible. But that's my own opinion there. I would think that there's this psalm is repeated in another form, probably for a literary reason. But anyway, into the psalm itself, you've got the fool says in his heart, there is no God. It's interesting, the kind of wording at the start. It says literally, he says the fool in his heart. So already the emphasis right from the start, he says, is from his speech. And one thing you notice is that the speech is to the heart. It's not only saying things out loud for others to hear them. It's something that he's saying to himself. And the heart in the Bible suggests it represents the inner person, the thinking, feeling, and willing part of somebody's inner life. It's the kind of center of their inner life. And so the issue here is what someone's saying to themselves. And so if it's foolish, then I think we can conclude that it's an issue of self-deception, what somebody tells themselves. I think that's an interesting thing, because we all tell ourselves things. We may even say something publicly, but what we tell ourselves is something slightly different there. So we can maybe even ask, do the things that we say we believe about God, are they the things that we are really telling our own hearts, saying to ourselves? So an example of this, and it's relevant to the Psalms, is this. We say I believe in God, but really I call the shots in my life. I don't really need him. He's almost like an accessory or something that makes me feel better. And we may deep down think or tell ourselves that he has nothing to say about the really important issues in my life. I would rather make those decisions. So as you can see, the idea here is about self-sufficiency. And that's really what the word fool means. It's not somebody who's intellectually deficient or a bit thick. It's somebody who is stubborn and proud against reason, somebody who's insensitive to the point where they won't welcome any other input, any outside voices. And that is a position which leads to an immoral life, simply because they don't care, they won't listen to what other people are saying to them. They think they have all the resources and wisdom they need on their own, from their own limited perspective. So this person is just simply determined to follow their own path, regardless of reason or advice, and regardless of how it affects others. And that's where the immoral aspect comes in. They can't see how their behavior leads to ruin for either themselves or other people. They just have a life which is lived according to their own limited inner perspective. And when we come to verse 2, we can see why God then therefore says, the psalmist presents a perspective from a different position. It says God looks down from the heavens. So you can see God's overall looking down. That's a different perspective, which is meant to contrast the limited inner perspective of the fool in verse 1. Here we have the perspective from heaven, the perspective of all eternity, the control room of the whole universe. And we go on that verse, it talks about the children of man. He looks in the children of man. The word children just reminds us that this seemingly autonomous individual who's living in arrogance, I mean, they're not really that independent. They're not a self-existent person, or self-sufficient even. They don't exist on their own. They're a child. They've depended on someone else. They are a child. And God's looking over all this, and he's asking the question, who really thinks and lives according to the reality that I've made? Are they all self-deceived, all of humanity? does anyone actually really see reality for what it is, that I exist and I've made all this? And he's saying, who is able to lift their eyes from all this self-absorption and be able to discern there's a greater wisdom than even them? Who's humble enough to bring their lives to God and to seek him? And then we move on to verses 3 and 4. And we see an interesting thing in verse 3, where there's a corporate and an individual element that kind of come together. So on one hand, it says there's no one who does good. No one suggests an individual, but it says together they've become corrupt. And so there's individual and there's corporate influence here. And the idea here is that people have decided themselves to pursue this mentality, this worldview, where they're just autonomous individuals. They don't need God and they don't need anyone else. But in the same vein, they're encouraging one another to do the same. There's like a societal phenomenon where people are encouraging one another to think like this. And this creates a society where everyone influences one another for evil and not for good, simply because they are acting as if there is no God. And everyone becomes a law unto themselves, as the phrase goes. And in verse 4, we have God asking this question: have they no knowledge? And this question simply means, why are they not able to understand? He's really asking it that way. Why don't these people know or see what they ought to know and see? And he summarized this in 2 points. He says there's 2 problems with the arrogant human nature that's before us. It says they exploit the people that God's made, and they don't call out to God. So the questions he's asking is along the lines of this: why should they behave like this and think there's no consequence? Why would somebody look at the world that God has made and conclude that either he'd condone what they're doing or he'd stand by and allow it? And that leads into verses 5 and 6, where you see 2 very similar structures in these verses, where we hear something about the attitude of these people, and then we hear something about God. And really it's emphasizing what it costs them when they forsake God, when they forge ahead with their own plans and ignore God and exploit others. So first, it says there's intense dread, that people are terrified. There they are, terrified. And it begs the question, are they terrified as they're living these foolish lives? Or should they be terrified because of the consequence of these foolish lives? And I think it could be either. I suspect it's as they live. It's talking about when you're motivated by fear. You look at these people, they're all motivated by fear. And they're trying to deal with that fear. They're trying to manage it in some way by living a certain way. But the blindness means that they're just simply plunging themselves deeper into fear rather than alleviating it. And all the while, whilst they're doing this, they're forsaking the very thing that would calm their fears. And that's the guarantee of God's presence. So it says that God is with the righteousness. So they're forsaking the very thing that would calm their fears, and they're completely driven by it. Second is about exploiting the poor. And are people exploiting the poor because they're evil to the core? Well, I don't think it is. No one stands up and says, yep, I'm evil. Evil is always convinced that it's doing something utterly fair and reasonable and necessary. It does immoral things, but it simply seeks to morally justify them. That's how wickedness and evil works in the normal person. You find very few people who actually think, I'm going to get a kick out of doing something evil today. People do exist, but I think they're thankfully the very, very small minority. The rest of us work by justifying morally what we already suspect is immoral. I remember reading about Tiger Woods and all of his kind of extramarital indiscretions, and he simply said he got to the point where he believed his own hype and he thought he deserved it. He could have whatever he wanted. It sounds shocking to us, but in the moment, he was simply telling himself that what he was doing was not immoral. It was absolutely fair and reasonable and what he deserved at that moment. I think we're exactly the same. I think people frustrate or shame the counsel or the plans of the poor for exactly the same reason. They don't think they like doing that sort of thing, but it's simply they tell themselves that they can justify their needs, justify that behavior, and that's where we all are. And I think that when we think life is about self-advancement, and that we don't really have to justify ourselves to anyone, then really there's no moral reason to choose somebody else's needs over our own. And that's why we exploit. That's where we're party to exploiting the poor and the vulnerable. But again, what this verse tells us is that it forsakes what the humble poor person has, and that's God. So, and this time it's interesting, it uses God's own personal name here. And it says that he is their refuge. That's what we forsake. We forsake God being our refuge when we pursue that life. It simply underlines the fact that the poor people, the humble person, is known to God and that he's close to them and that he is their protector. The arrogant person can't know this security. It's just simply not possible. Finally, verse 7 seems a little bit of a puzzle. What's it all about? Why break out in a cry for deliverance from Zion? Why cry out for the restoring of the fortunes and the rejoicing of Israel and Jacob? How does this fit into the rest of the psalm? Well, the writer here is surveying the whole of the nation and the whole of his society. And I think in light of the statements he's made, that there's no one who seeks God, he's deeply concerned about his society, about his community. And it's become of self-obsessed and arrogant people. And I think he knows this is a bad place for any society to be in terms of morality, in terms of protecting the vulnerable, and it tends to spread through the society, increasing people adopt this attitude if it's there. So it's just a society where God needs to intervene, and that's why he says it requires God to turn and change the state of mind or the well-being of his people. And for me, it just brings to mind Christ, our Lord Jesus. How did he live when he was here? How did the Gospels present his life? He embodied an attitude that was completely the opposite of the arrogant, self-centered fool. He depended entirely on his Father. He sought out the vulnerable and the weak instead of treading on them on his way to glory. And more importantly, he created this new community, that by his presence and influence, these people would turn and become a new community or society, those who live and act and think differently, who seek God, who seek out the poor and build them up. That's why this writer is imagining an Israel where there's a deliverer who changes people and who delivers them and creates a wonderful new society with God at the center and where the poor and the downtrodden are lifted up. What a vision. So hopefully that's helpful. Have a good week. We'll see you guys soon. Bye.